the early 1940s, deep inside Nazi Germany, massive weapons factories roared to life before sunrise. As war consumed Europe, speed and efficiency became more important than craftsmanship. The MP40 submachine gun was designed not as a masterpiece, but as a machine of war that could be produced in enormous numbers. Every morning, thousands of workers passed through these gates, feeding an industrial system built for one purpose only: mass production. Inside the foundry halls, steel was melted at extreme temperatures, transforming raw metal into the backbone of the MP40. Molten steel flowed like fire into long molds, forming the core components of one of the most recognizable weapons of World War II. Once cooled, the steel moved immediately to stamping halls. Unlike traditional rifles, the MP40 relied heavily on stamped metal parts. This revolutionary approach allowed faster production, reduced cost, and required less skilled labor. Gigantic presses slammed down thousands of times per day, shaping receiver halves with brutal efficiency. Precision was not optional. Any flaw could mean failure on the battlefield. Barrels were machined on lathes, spinning relentlessly as workers shaved steel down to exact tolerances. Inspectors checked every dimension, knowing a single error could cost lives. On the assembly lines, men and women worked side by side, installing trigger systems, springs, and bolt assemblies. Each movement was timed, repeated, and optimized. Heat treatment hardened the critical components, while oil quenching locked strength into the steel. Sparks, flames, and smoke filled the air. Final machining aligned the receiver halves, yet transforming loose parts into functioning weapons. The MP40 took shape rapidly, simple, brutal, and effective. Before leaving the factory, every weapon was tested, inspected, and stamped for approval. There was no room for delay. The war demanded speed. Finally, completed MP40s were packed into wooden crates, ready for rail transport to the front lines. This factory did not slow down. Day and night, it fed the war machine, one MP40 at a time. As the MP40 moved deeper into production, speed never replaced control. Stamped receiver halves were locked into steel jigs, ensuring alignment before permanent welding. Spot welds sealed the seams, turning thin sheets of steel into a rigid weapon body. After cooling, drill presses cut precise pinholes. Every measurement mattered. Even in mass production, tolerances could not be ignored. But meanwhile, another critical component took shape: the magazine. Long, straight, and unforgiving, the MP40 magazine demanded precision. Any distortion could cause feeding failures in combat. Steel sheets were stamped, welded, and loaded with powerful springs designed to push cartridges upward with relentless force. At the same time, bakelite grips were molded under heat and pressure. This early plastic reduced weight and saved metal, a crucial advantage as resources grew scarce. Folding stocks were riveted together, giving the MP40 its compact silhouette, perfect for armored crews and urban combat. All major components now converged on parallel conveyors. Receivers, barrels, stocks, and magazines moved in synchronized flow, each station feeding the next without pause. At final assembly benches, barrels were torqued into receivers, the trigger groups pinned into place, and bolts slid home with practiced efficiency. Workers manually cycled each weapon, listening for resistance or hesitation. The MP40's distinctive mechanical sound was instantly recognizable. Before any finish was applied, weapons were stripped of oil and residue. Clean metal was essential for corrosion resistance. Black oxide coating followed. Rows of MP40s disappeared into dark chemical baths, emerging moments later with their iconic matte black finish, functional, non-reflective, and lethal. As the weapons dried, inspectors checked every surface for flaws. In wartime production, perfection was impossible, but failure was unacceptable. By this stage, the MP40 was no longer just a collection of parts. It was a finished instrument of war, shaped by industrial necessity and relentless demand. And the factory line kept moving. With assembly complete, each MP40 entered a final phase of identification and control. Serial numbers were engraved directly into the steel receivers, binding each weapon to a factory, a batch, and a moment in the war. Proof marks followed, stamped by inspectors whose approval determined whether a gun moved forward or was scrapped. The finished weapons returned to the line for detailed mechanical testing. Magazines were fitted, charging handles pulled, bolts cycled again and again. Every sound, every resistance was evaluated by experienced hands. Trigger pull weight was measured precisely. Too light meant danger. Too heavy meant failure in combat. Safety mechanisms were engaged and disengaged repeatedly, ensuring reliability under stress. Then balance checks confirmed that the weapon met handling expectations. The MP40 was designed for close-quarters combat, and its weight distribution mattered. Only then were selected weapons cleared for live fire testing. Inside reinforced firing tunnels, operators discharged short bursts into steel traps. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness. Spent casings flew violently from the ejection ports. After firing, weapons were inspected once more. Any abnormal wear, any hesitation, meant rejection. Those that passed were cleaned, lubricated, and restored to factory condition. Final approval was documented in ledgers, rows of signatures marking the relentless output of war. Completed MP40s were moved into storage racks, standing silently in perfect rows. Wooden crates replaced workbenches. Each crate represented dozens of weapons destined for soldiers, vehicles, and battlefields across Europe. As the crates were sealed and labeled, they were transferred to rail platforms. Trains waited constantly. There was no surplus. Everything built here had a destination. Inside the factory, the lines never stopped. Even as shipments left, new steel entered the furnaces. This was not craftsmanship. It was industrial warfare, and the MP40 was one of its most efficient products. As the war intensified, production targets rose relentlessly. Inside planning offices overlooking the factory floor, schedules were revised daily. Every delay at the front meant increased pressure behind these walls. Steel deliveries became unpredictable. Materials were rationed, counted, and reused wherever possible. Nothing was wasted. The machines ran without rest. Presses that once shut down at night now operated continuously. When they broke, repairs happened on the spot. No shutdowns, no excuses. Workers pushed past exhaustion. Long shifts blurred into one another beneath dim industrial lights. Breaks were short. Fatigue was visible, but ignored. Design compromises followed. Parts were simplified. Finishing steps were reduced or eliminated. Cosmetic perfection no longer mattered. Function did. Alternative alloys replaced higher-grade steel as shortages grew. Inspectors approved substitutions with a single goal: keep production moving. Output numbers were tracked obsessively. Chalk marks on tally boards told the real story of the war, measured not in victories, but in units produced. Night shifts replaced day crews seamlessly. The factory never slept. The furnaces burned continuously, glowing like artificial suns inside concrete walls. Inspection standards tightened in some areas and loosened in others. Speed became the new metric of success. Crates stacked faster than rail cars could remove them. Logistics officers argued over priorities: infantry units, armored divisions, or emergency resupply. Under blackout conditions, trains were loaded in near darkness to avoid air raids. Every shipment carried urgency. Sirens marked the passing of time, not the end of work. Hands repeated the same motions thousands of times per shift, movements becoming mechanical, almost unconscious. This factory no longer built weapons. It sustained momentum. The MP40 flowed endlessly from steel to crate, from crate to rail, from rail to the front. And as long as the war continued, this machine would not stop. As the MP40 reached the front lines, its impact returned to the factory in the form of reports, maps, and urgent demands. Battlefield feedback dictated production decisions. Success increased pressure. Losses demanded replacement. Supervisors relayed new targets. Assembly lines adjusted pace without discussion. Speed became reflex. Defective weapons were no longer delayed. They were dismantled immediately. Every usable component was recovered. Scrap returned to furnaces, beginning the cycle again. Inspectors received briefings not just on measurements, but on battlefield function. Reliability mattered more than finish. Approval processes accelerated. Stamps fell rapidly, sometimes without pause. Crates marked priority stacked high, waiting only for transport. Rail yards worked relentlessly. The trains departed as soon as they were loaded, often returning hours later for more. Inside the factory, reminders of the war appeared everywhere. Casualty lists passed silently in corridors. Workers read them briefly, then returned to their stations. There was no time for reflection. Furnaces burned through the night. Orders were signed faster. Personal items remained untouched in lockers. Crates were sealed with urgency. Trains departed again. Steel arrived again. The cycle never slowed. What began as raw metal ended as weapons, and those weapons returned as demand. By this stage, the factory no longer reacted to the war. It anticipated it. Production became automatic. Human movement matched machine rhythm. Smoke rose endlessly into the night sky, marking a place where time, labor, and material were consumed without pause. But the MP40 was no longer just a weapon. It was the product of an industrial system designed for total war. When the war ended, the machines finally stopped. Factories that once roared day and night fell silent. Presses froze mid-motion. Assembly lines stood empty, their purpose erased overnight. Unfinished MP40s remained where workers had last touched them. Tools abandoned, parts left half-assembled. The urgency was gone, replaced by absence. Rail yards lay destroyed. Crates once bound for the front were scattered and forgotten. As Allied forces moved in, they found not just weapons, but an entire system designed for speed, efficiency, and scale. The MP40 was examined, catalogued, and studied, not as a symbol, but as a lesson. Engineers dismantled it piece by piece. They noted its simplicity, its reliance on stamped metal, its ability to be produced faster than traditional firearms. In many ways, the MP40 represented the future of weapon manufacturing. Cheap, fast, replaceable. After the war, the factory buildings decayed. Nature reclaimed concrete and steel. What had once consumed thousands of lives and tons of metal slowly disappeared. But the weapon did not vanish. Preserved examples entered museums. Behind glass, the MP40 became an artifact, no longer a tool of war, but evidence of how industry reshaped conflict. Historians studied production records and factory footage, tracing how manufacturing decisions altered battlefields. The MP40 influenced generations of weapon design. Its principles echoed far beyond World War II. Today, it stands as a reminder that modern warfare is not only fought by soldiers, but by factories, systems, art, and supply lines. The MP40 was never meant to be legendary. It was meant to be produced, and in that, it succeeded.